Michael Davidson had lived in his modest country home for over 20 years. His property sat at the edge of an upscale development called Oak Ridge Estates, but Michael's house predated the neighborhood by decades. A crown jewel of his 3-acre property was a small creek that meandered through his backyard, attracting local wildlife and providing a serene soundtrack to his otherwise quiet life. Michael, a retired environmental engineer, had meticulously maintained the natural ecosystem around the creek. He planted native flowers along its banks, installed small rock formations to create gentle rapids, and even built a wooden footbridge that had become his favorite spot for morning coffee. His neighbors from the older surrounding rural area often commented on the natural beauty he had cultivated. Every morning, Michael followed the same routine. He would wake at dawn, brew a pot of strong coffee in the ceramic pot his late wife Helen had given him for their 30th anniversary, and carry it out to the footbridge. There he would sit on the hand-carved bench, watching mist rise from the water as the first rays of sunlight filtered through the oak and maple trees that lined his property. Occasionally, a great blue heron would visit, standing motionless in the shallow water as it waited for fish. Michael had named it Harold, though he knew it was probably a different bird each time. The creek itself wasn't large. At its widest point, it stretched perhaps 6 feet across, but it was deep enough in places to support a small population of trout and minnows. In spring, the banks exploded with wildflowers, purple coneflowers, black-eyed Susans, and cardinal flowers that attracted hummingbirds and butterflies. Michael had learned over the years which native plants thrived in this microclimate and which helped maintain the delicate balance of the ecosystem. His knowledge wasn't just theoretical. Before retiring, Michael had spent 30 years working for the county's Environmental Management Office, specializing in water protection and ecological restoration. The creek had been his passion project, a way to put into practice all he had learned over his career. He kept meticulous records of water quality, plant growth, and wildlife sightings in leather-bound journals stacked neatly in his home office. The locals respected Michael's expertise. Teachers from the elementary school 5 miles down the road would bring their classes on field trips to learn about aquatic ecosystems. Michael would don his faded ranger hat, a souvenir from a long-ago visit to Yellowstone, and lead the children on expeditions along the creek banks, teaching them to identify insects, test water clarity, and understand the interconnectedness of nature. His reputation extended to the county offices as well. When developers had first proposed the Oak Ridge Estates development 15 years ago, Michael had consulted with the Planning Commission to ensure buffer zones were established to protect the local watershed. The original developers had worked cooperatively with him, recognizing that the natural beauty of the area was part of what made their luxury homes so desirable. Everything changed when Oak Ridge Estates expanded their development, building a new section of luxury homes that backed up to Michael's property line. The new development company had bought out the original builders, and they came with different priorities. Within weeks of breaking ground on Phase 3 of the project, Michael noticed increased sedimentation in the creek water, a sign that the construction was affecting runoff patterns. The HOA, under new leadership, quickly took notice of Michael's creek, and they weren't pleased. On a crisp autumn morning, Michael was tending to some plantings near the creek when a sharp knock on his fence interrupted his peace. There stood Caroline Winters, the newly elected HOA president of Oak Ridge Estates, flanked by 2 board members. Even from a distance, Michael could tell they weren't there for a friendly chat. Caroline was dressed in an immaculate navy pantsuit despite the muddy terrain, her platinum blonde hair pulled into a tight bun, not a strand out of place. Behind her stood a thin man clutching a tablet and a heavyset woman whose eyes darted critically around Michael's property. "Mr. Davidson," Caroline began without introduction, her voice carrying the crisp efficiency of someone used to running corporate meetings, "we've received multiple complaints about your water feature." She gestured dismissively toward the creek, as if it were an unsightly lawn ornament rather than a natural waterway. "It's attracting insects and wildlife that our residents find concerning, not to mention the aesthetic inconsistency with our community standards." Michael straightened up slowly, his knees protesting after an hour of kneeling in the soil. He wiped his dirt-covered hands on his faded jeans and approached the fence, taking a deep breath to remain calm. "This creek has been flowing through this property for longer than any of us have been alive, Ms. Winters," he explained, trying to keep his tone friendly. "It's not a water feature. It's a natural waterway that feeds into the county water system." The man with the tablet, whom Caroline introduced curtly as Mr. Perkins, our architectural compliance officer, cleared his throat and began reading from a document. Section 7.3 of the Oak Ridge Estates Covenant clearly states that all water management features visible from community properties must conform to the aesthetic guidelines established by the board. Furthermore, Section 12.1 prohibits the maintenance of any habitat that might attract non-domestic animals into the community perimeter. Michael tried explaining that the creek was a natural waterway that had existed long before their development, that it was part of a local watershed, and that he had all proper environmental permits. He even offered to show them the documentation from his time working with the county. "I have every legal right," he began, but Caroline raised a manicured hand to cut him off. "Our property values are at stake," she insisted, her voice dropping to a tone that suggested she was explaining something to a child. "The new homes in Phase 3 are selling for upwards of 7 figures. The board has decided that you need to redirect the creek underground or fill it in completely. We've prepared the necessary paperwork for you to sign, acknowledging our requirements." Michael felt his face flush with anger, but years of bureaucratic negotiations had taught him to control his temper. "I'm afraid that won't be possible. This creek is protected by county environmental regulations. I can't and won't redirect or fill it in." The heavyset woman, who hadn't spoken until now, leaned forward. "My husband and I paid $1.2 million for our home, Mr. Davidson. We didn't pay that kind of money to look out at a swamp with mosquitoes and who knows what else crawling around." "It's a thriving riparian ecosystem, ma'am, not a swamp," Michael corrected, his patience wearing thin. When Michael firmly refused to sign their documents, Caroline's professional veneer cracked slightly. Her eyes narrowed and her tone turned cold. "You should understand something, Mr. Davidson. Most of our residents are executives, lawyers, and business owners. We have resources you couldn't imagine, Mr. Davidson. I suggest you comply willingly. It would be a shame if this got complicated." As they turned to leave, Michael called after them, "The county environmental office has copies of all my permits. You might want to check with them before you do anything hasty." Caroline didn't bother to turn around, but Michael caught the slight stiffening of her shoulders. He watched them pick their way carefully back through the tree line that separated his property from the new development, an uneasy feeling settling in his stomach. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. 2 weeks later, Michael returned from grocery shopping to find construction equipment on the property line. A yellow excavator and a dump truck were parked where his land met the Oak Ridge Estate's boundary, and workers in hard hats were installing concrete barriers and drainage pipes that effectively dammed the creek at the point where it entered his property from Oak Ridge land. Michael slammed on his brakes, his truck skidding slightly on the gravel driveway. He leaked out, leaving groceries forgotten on the passenger seat, and ran toward the workers. "Stop! What are you doing? You can't block this creek," he shouted, his voice cracking with panic. The foreman, a burly man with a salt and pepper beard, approached with his hands raised in a placating gesture. "Look, sir, we're just doing what we were contracted to do. Got all the paperwork right here." He handed Michael a folder containing what appeared to be work permits. Michael scanned the documents, his hands trembling with anger. The permits were for stormwater management improvements on Oak Ridge Estate's property, technically not crossing onto his land, but positioned precisely to cut off the creek's flow before it reached his property line. "This is illegal," Michael insisted. "You need specific permits to modify a natural waterway. These are general construction permits." The foreman shrugged. "That's above my pay grade, sir. We were hired to do a job, and these papers say we can do it. You got a problem, you'll need to take it up with whoever hired us." Panicked, Michael called the local sheriff's department, but the deputy who responded claimed it was a civil matter since the construction was taking place on Oak Ridge property. His calls to the county environmental office went to voicemail. It was Friday afternoon, and he knew from experience that no one would respond until Monday at the earliest. He even tried contacting former colleagues, but reached only administrative assistants who couldn't help without authorization. The HOA had moved with surprising speed and efficiency, clearly timing their action for when countermeasures would be most difficult to mobilize. By evening, the concrete barriers were in place, and the creek's flow had reduced to a trickle. Michael stood on his footbridge as the sunset painted the sky in ironic shades of orange and pink, watching the water level drop inch by inch. The gentle burbling sound that had been the soundtrack to his life for 2 decades grew fainter by the hour. Within days, the vibrant ecosystem Michael had nurtured for decades began to wither. The water striders and dragonflies disappeared first. Then the frogs fell silent. But once damp banks began to dry and crack, and the native plants started to droop, Harold the heron made one final appearance, standing puzzled in the muddy remnants of the once flowing creek before flying away and not returning. The wildlife disappeared, plants along the banks began to die, and the peaceful sound of running water was replaced by an oppressive silence. Michael documented everything. He took photographs every morning and evening, recording the creek's decline with scientific precision even as his heart broke. He collected water samples from the diminishing pools and noted the oxygen levels dropping. He kept a log of which species disappeared and when. His environmentalist's mind remained sharp even as his spirit flagged. When Michael drove to the Oak Ridge Estate's office to confront Caroline again, he found her in the community clubhouse, hosting a meeting about landscape improvements for the neighborhood entrance. She excused herself briefly to speak with him in the hallway, her smile never reaching her cold eyes. "You've destroyed a thriving ecosystem," Michael said, his voice low but intense. "This is illegal, and you know it." Caroline adjusted her designer glasses and smiled coldly. "We've consulted with our attorneys. The waterway management on our property is entirely within our rights. The water originates on land that now belongs to the Oak Ridge Estates Community Association, and we're simply redirecting it more efficiently." She handed him a business card. "If you'd like to discuss this further, you're welcome to hire legal representation. Our attorneys are standing by." Michael, living on a fixed retirement income, couldn't afford a protracted legal battle against the well-funded HOA. His retirement savings had dwindled after Helen's long illness, and what remained was earmarked for his granddaughter's college fund. The HOA, with its seven-figure budget and cadre of homeowners who were themselves attorneys and executives, could outspend and outlast him easily. But what Caroline didn't know was that Michael's environmental engineering background had given him intimate knowledge of the area's water systems, knowledge that would prove invaluable. As he walked back to his truck, dejected but not defeated, a plan began forming in his mind. Rather than confronting the HOA directly, Michael began a methodical investigation. The engineer in him knew that emotional appeals wouldn't work. He needed hard data and legal leverage. He transformed his dining room into a makeshift command center, with maps spread across the table and stacks of documents organized in manila folders. First, he pulled public records on the Oak Ridge Estates development from the county clerk's office. The clerk, Marjorie, had worked with Michael for years and was sympathetic to his plight. "This might interest you," she said quietly, sliding an additional folder across her desk. The original environmental impact statement for Oak Ridge mentioned something about water's protections. Night after night, Michael pored over the documents by lamplight, his reading glasses perched on the end of his nose. He reviewed county water management plans, comparing the original development proposals with what had actually been built. He studied topographical maps showing the water flow patterns across the entire area, tracing the creek's path with his finger from its source in the hills above Oak Ridge, all the way to where it joined the larger river system 5 miles downstream. Michael even contacted former colleagues from his environmental engineering days. His old friend Davis, now a senior supervisor in the regional EPA office, met him for coffee at a diner far from Oak Ridge Estates. "Caroline Winters," Davis mused, stirring his coffee thoughtfully. "Name sounds familiar. Wasn't she involved in that shopping center development that got fined for wetlands violations last year?" "That's her," Michael confirmed. "Seems she learned her lesson about public confrontations. This time she's operating more discreetly." Davis passed a thumb drive across the table. "These are internal records on all the water's permits in the county for the past 20 years. Not exactly public information yet, but nothing classified either. Might find something useful." His persistence paid off when he discovered something the developers had kept quiet. The entire Oak Ridge Estates neighborhood had been built on a sensitive watershed area, and the development had received permits only after promising to maintain certain natural water flows, including the creek that ran through Michael's property. The breakthrough came at 2 a.m. on a Tuesday morning. Michael had been cross-referencing permit dates when he found a crucial discrepancy. The final approval for Oak Ridge Estates had included specific conditions, legally binding commitments that ran with the land title, not just with the original developers. "Here it is," he whispered to himself, underlining a paragraph with his trembling finger. The approval document stated explicitly, "The natural waterway designated as Eagle Creek must be maintained in its current flow pattern to ensure downstream watershed integrity." Further digging revealed more critical information. The HOA had never filed for the permits required to modify a natural waterway. The drainage system they installed violated county regulations, and the concrete barriers they used contained materials prohibited near natural water sources. A detail he confirmed by sneaking onto the construction site after dark and collecting samples to send to a lab for analysis. Most importantly, Michael discovered that the creek didn't just flow from Oak Ridge Estates through his property. It continued downhill to feed a protected wetland area that the county had spent millions to preserve. The wetland was home to several endangered amphibian species and served as a crucial stopover for migratory birds. Any disruption to the creek's flow would eventually impact this protected area, a fact that the HOA had either overlooked or deliberately ignored. Michael created a detailed spreadsheet documenting every violation with references to specific statutes and regulations. He compiled photographs, water quality analyses, and testimony from biologists about the creek's ecological significance. He even used his old surveying equipment to create precise measurements proving that the HOA's actions had already begun to affect water levels in the downstream wetlands. When his investigation was complete, Michael sat on his porch looking out at the now nearly dry creek bed. He sipped his coffee. It didn't taste the same without the sound of flowing water accompanying it, and allowed himself a small, determined smile. For the first time since the blockade, he felt a sense of hope. Caroline Winters and her HOA had made a critical mistake. They had assumed Michael was just a sentimental old man who could be easily bullied. They were about to discover just how wrong they were. After 3 weeks of investigation, Michael was ready to act. But rather than confronting Caroline and the HOA board directly, he took a different approach. On a Monday morning at precisely 9:00 a.m., he simultaneously submitted his comprehensive report to the County Environmental Protection Office, the Water Management Authority, and the state's Environmental Compliance Department. He hand-delivered each copy to ensure they couldn't be lost in the system. "This is quite something, Michael," said Eleanor Martinez, the director of the County Environmental Office and a former mentee of Michael's. She flipped through the 3-inch thick binder, her eyebrows rising. "You've done our work for us." "I had plenty of time on my hands lately," Michael replied dryly. "My creek meditation spot isn't exactly usable these days." The report was a masterpiece of methodical documentation. It detailed every violation committed by the Oak Ridge Estates HOA, complete with photographs, maps, and references to specific regulations. One section focused entirely on the concrete composition, which contained industrial additives banned from use near waterways. Another section included before and after water quality analyses from the protected wetlands, showing alarming increases in sediment and chemical pollutants since the creek had been diverted. Most standing was the appendix containing emails Michael had obtained through a public records request, communications between the original developers and the county explicitly acknowledging the creek's protected status as a condition for the development's approval. Eleanor closed the binder and looked at Michael. "This is serious. Very serious. I'm going to need to call in the regional EPA office." "I've already sent them a copy," Michael said, "and the State Water Resources Board, and the Attorney General's Environmental Crimes Division." Eleanor's eyes widened. "You're not messing around." Michael leaned forward. "They destroyed something precious, Eleanor. Not just to me, but to the whole ecosystem. And they did it knowing it was wrong." Within 3 days, county officials arrived at Oak Ridge Estates with cease and desist orders. Residents watched in confusion as construction equipment returned, not to further the HOA's plans, but to remove the illegal barriers under official orders. Environmental inspectors in bright yellow vests swarmed the area, taking samples and photographs. News vans parked at the entrance to the community, their satellite dishes extended. Caroline tried to manage the situation, holding an impromptu press conference on her manicured lawn. "This is simply a misunderstanding about routine water management," she insisted to the cameras. Oak Ridge Estates has always been committed to environmental stewardship. Her statement backfired spectacularly when a reporter asked about the preliminary fines, $175,000 for operating without permits, and an additional $500 per day for ongoing environmental damage. The reporter had evidently been given a copy of the official citation, listing 14 separate violations of environmental regulations. But Michael wasn't finished. Using his connections with former colleagues, he arranged a private meeting with the county commissioners and senior environmental protection officials at the county administration building. He entered the wood-paneled meeting room to find Caroline and the HOA's attorney already seated at the table, looking distinctly uncomfortable. Mr. Davidson, the head commissioner, greeted him. "We've invited representatives from Oak Ridge Estates to hear your proposal directly." Michael nodded at Caroline, whose face remained impassive, though her knuckles were white around her leather portfolio. He opened his presentation with drone footage showing the creek's path from the mountains through Oak Ridge Estates and his property to the protected wetlands. Then he presented financial estimates he prepared with the help of his civil engineering firm. At the meeting, he presented a choice. Either the Oak Ridge Estates development could restore the natural water flow and establish a permanent conservation easement around the creek, estimated cost $230,000 plus annual maintenance, or the county could revoke their developmental variances entirely. That second option would require the HOA to redesign and reconstruct their entire stormwater management system to comply with the original permit requirements, estimated costs over $2.8 million. "The choice is yours," Michael said, looking directly at Caroline. "Restore what you destroyed or face the consequences." The county's ultimatum sent shockwaves through Oak Ridge Estates. Within hours of the meeting, residents began receiving email notifications about an emergency HOA meeting. Rumors spread through the community like wildfire. Some said the HOA was bankrupt. Others claimed they were facing criminal charges. Property values, the very thing Caroline had been so determined to protect, began to wobble as real estate agents fielded nervous calls from homeowners. The community center was packed to capacity for the emergency meeting. Michael had been invited, or rather summoned, by the HOA's attorney. He sat quietly in the back row, watching as Caroline took the podium, her usual confidence noticeably diminished. "As many of you have heard," she began, her voice tight, "we are facing some regulatory challenges regarding our recent water management improvements." "You mean the illegal dam that's got us all over the evening news?" A man in the front row interrupted. He stood up, identifying himself as Dr. Wilson from Oakwood Drive. My colleagues at the hospital are asking if I live in that community that's destroying protected wetlands. Do you have any idea what this is doing to our reputation? Forget property values or becoming environmental pariahs. The meeting quickly descended into chaos. Residents who had been unaware of their HOA's actions were outraged upon learning their association dues might increase substantially to cover the fines and required remediation. When Caroline tried to defend the board's decisions as protecting community interests, several residents demanded to see the minutes from meetings where these decisions had been made. There was no community vote on this, pointed out Jennifer Santos, a corporate attorney who lived in Phase 2. The board is required to put capital expenditures over $50,000 to a community vote. Where was the vote for this water project? It was then that Thomas Brewer, the HOA treasurer, cleared his throat and approached the microphone. There was no vote, he admitted, looking uncomfortable. The project was classified as emergency maintenance to bypass the voting requirement. Whose idea was that classification? Jennifer pressed. All eyes turned to Caroline, who suddenly seemed very interested in the papers before her. It was revealed that Caroline had acted largely on her own authority, misrepresenting the situation to both residents and board members. She had presented the creek as a potential mosquito breeding ground and unregulated water hazard in board meetings, never mentioning its protected status or the permit requirements for altering it. The board had trusted her expertise as a former commercial real estate developer without verifying her claims. I was protecting our investments, Caroline finally said defensively. That creek is an eyesore that was affecting the marketability of our new properties. You mean your property? Someone called out. Your house is the only one that directly faces that creek. As the truth emerged that Caroline's primary motivation had been improving the view from her own $1.8 million home, residents' anger reached a boiling point. The meeting ended with her resignation and a complete restructuring of the HOA board. The following evening, Michael answered a knock at his door to find a woman in her early 60s standing on his porch, holding a large potted plant, a native cardinal flower that would thrive along the creek banks once the water returned. I'm Margaret Chen, she introduced herself, the new board president at Oak Ridge. I taught biology at the university for 30 years before retiring. I've always admired what you've done with this creek ecosystem, though I never had the courage to say so when Caroline was in charge. She offered the plant along with a formal apology letter from the HOA and a proposal for collaboration. The new board's first official action had been to unanimously approve the restoration option Michael had proposed. The HOA would not only restore the creek's flow, but would establish a neighborhood nature committee to help maintain the watershed area, with Michael as a consulting advisor. We're thinking of creating a nature trail along the creek, Margaret explained as they walked toward the footbridge. Educational plaques about the ecosystem, perhaps some benches. With your permission, of course. Many of us move here because we love nature, not despite it. 6 months later, the creek flowed stronger than ever. The banks that had been damaged were replanted with native species, and the wildlife gradually returned. A family of otters, never before seen in the area, established a den near a bend in the creek, their appearance a biological confirmation of the water's restored health. Michael's wooden footbridge was rebuilt with help from Oak Ridge residents, many of whom now regularly strolled along the